Hey guys, thank you so much for joining me in another video. So as you can tell based on the title, well today we are talking about handbags from 2009. To understand 2009, I think it's really helpful to watch my previous video, handbags from 2008. There's a whole playlist on various years, and this is of course part one. This is going to be multi-part series as I have time to work on these videos, but it's really fun to talk about these things, to go back in time. And in the year 2009, we're at the end of the 2000s, which was a very chaotic decade when we saw at the beginning the Y2K aesthetics. Think of bags like the Dior saddlebag, and then sort of the transition and like the move towards things like boho and slouchier bags. Think of the Chloe Paddington or like the Fendi Spy bag. A lot of the bags that we're actually seeing right now in 2025, we're kind of at that like perfect 20-year mark where a lot of these brands are reissuing these bags at their 20th anniversary roughly. But throughout the decade, we also saw the consistent popularity of the Balenciaga City bag. That bag still hits today, just has this it girl vibe. So if we're looking at this from like a cultural level, towards the end of this decade, we saw the continual rise in reality TV. There's still the prevalence of tabloid culture, the fascination with young women that had this like party lifestyle, Britney, Lindsay, Paris. But I also think it was starting to look less aspirational. Tabloid magazines, the fascination with celebrities, it's always been a driving force. It's always been something people are interested in, and fashion really like latches on to whoever the rising young it girls of the time are. But what started to happen around this period, especially in the 2000s, the mid to late 2000s, a lot of young people started to get their cues online. So this was before Instagram, of course, before TikTok, blogging sites to fashion forums. These places would start documenting fashion. We would see this new rise of it girls. One of the quintessential kind of figures of this period is someone like Alexa Chung. Even other edgier fashion icons like Agnes Dean. Even if we think about like the music at the time, like the rise in these kinds of pop stars, Lady Gaga to Rihanna, fashion was moving towards a style that was just a little bit edgier. This girl was still a party girl, but instead of perhaps just going to clubs, places like music festivals, indie shows, maybe this girl was in a band herself, maybe she had a blog. These girls were very much online, but there was also a real life component as well. You had like an online persona that could be reflected in real time. I talked about this with my last video, but I think one of the bags of 2008 that was such a signifier of that time was the Proenza Schooler PS1. Very reminiscent of vintage school bags. It felt so right. It was edgy but modern, but also felt a little bit vintage. It spoke to that kind of fascination with like thrift culture, but it still felt modern. The kind of bag that could suit bloggers. Maybe you had a Canon DSLR, maybe you had a MacBook that you were going to the coffee shop with, or maybe you wanted a smaller size so that you could bring to a concert and wear low on the shoulder crossbody. But the bags like the Chloe Paddington, those bags were still cool, but there was a noticeable change that we started to see with silhouette towards the end of this decade. The party girls of the mid 2000s, there was sort of this dark turn happening, and I think this new online indie girl was a backlash to this. Again, this like edgier kind of look was really in. This indie girl, this hipster girl was a word that was often kind of used to describe this style, but I don't think these are always the best terms. No one actually really liked to use these terms. In hindsight, a lot of these terms are being used to describe this period, indie sleaze, etc. But if we think about 2009, this was kind of the pinnacle of this period. Also, we have to talk about the recession and this having a major impact on stylistic choices as well as the types of brands we would see. So the first bag I actually want to talk about is the Alexander Wang, the Rocco bag. So this debuted 2009 and it was instantly everywhere. Slouchier, but it had these very signature gold Peter studs on the bottom, carried by many famous it girls of the period, Mary-Kate Olsen, Rihanna, Ashley Tisdale. Alexander Wang was a designer on the rise. He was probably one of the designers that would be defining the styles of the 2010s, but he was really gaining traction as a new emerging indie designer. And while the Chanels, the Louis Vuittons, they always are kind of on the top of this food chain. Hermes, brands like Alexander Wang and Proenza Schouler, bags, they had these signature looks that kind of had this like anti-it bag attitude. Of course they became it bags, but it felt sort of like a rejection to a lot of the overt branding. This bag specifically, for lack of a better term, really fell in line with these edgy aesthetics that a lot of young people were into. A little bit more approachable in price point than, say, if you were going for a Chanel bag. And of course, less people knew about them. They weren't overt status markers. There was that kind of more, if you know, you know, in an indie way, not like this elitist way, but more of this, you're kind of in the know, but in a more indie way. You shopped at like certain stores, you went to certain coffee shops, you would go to certain shows, but your fashion expressed your taste in style and culture. And also, by the way, this is just part one. Again, I will do a part two on this series, and I was thinking about even doing the emerging designers that really took off during this period, but you know, maybe that's too niche. But anyways, that's why we're going to do this in a multi-part series. The next bag I have to talk about is the Marc by Marc Jacobs Pedal to the Metal. I'm going to say this line because it was one of the most recognizable handbag collections of this time. This was under the diffusion label Marc by Marc Jacobs. It was on the more accessible price point. Marc Jacobs was the creative director at Louis Vuitton, but of course he had his own line, and then this was a diffusion line of his own line. But the defining feature were these pair of metallic dove-shaped bird motifs in this gold tone kind of hardware that sat on the front flap, and they were usually slouchy, casual in silhouette, like messenger bags, satchels, crossbodies, soft leather. They could be in neutral colors, plums, mustards, but I think there were certain styles, like the Natasha was one of the more iconic styles, had this like flap crossbody with the zipper detailing and bird hardware. It was a whole line, but it spoke to that, I would say, playful indie girl, quirky, was instantly recognizable. I did a whole video on Marc Jacobs, the evolution of his various bags, so if you want to check that out. So next, the Stella McCartney Falabella bag. So when we think about vegan or vegetarian bags, we think of Stella McCartney. She served this market with this style. It was this really soft, slouchy, but you could tell it wasn't real leather if you touched it, but it was meant to mimic leather, and it had this very signature chain trim that made it edgy, right? That gave it that edgy look. And this became probably the most famous vegetarian friendly bag ever made. Again, going back to this idea of this kind of hipster, it really catered to that market where there was more of a concern for animal rights, for ethical shopping. It definitely was one of these styles that had a signature look to it, signature outline, gave this bag kind of a like tough yet chic look. The chain can be carried as a shoulder strap or a handheld. Also had this medallion. I have to say, when I look at the Chanel 22 bag, I think the precursor to that style was this. It was loved by many celebrities, many influencers. It became one of the it bags for like the vegans, but even if you weren't vegan, it was just a cool bag that many people liked. Next, we have to talk about the Mulberry Alexa, again inspired by Alexa Chung, who was one of the it girls of this period. It was like this satchel meets school bag silhouette, worn crossbody. It was a huge hit in the UK, but also globally, very reminiscent of the Proenza Schouler PS1. Again, I did a video on the style of Alexa Chung, but I also want to mention with Alexa Chung style, I think often a lot of fashion from this period is often described as indie sleaze. In hindsight, that's like a term that we often hear, and I think Alexa Chung definitely embodied that. But I think this other sort of side of her that was also under the hipster umbrella is this twee fashion. So it had a very distinct look in the late 2000s. It was very indie, vintage inspired. Think Peter Pan collar dresses, tights, cardigans, vintage inspired blouses with like ruffles, bows, puff sleeves, swing coats, Mary Janes, ballet flats, brogues, things like that. And these satchel type bags, these crossbody bags, these messenger type bags really worked with this aesthetic. I think again, like the Proenza Schouler appealed to that edgy style, but then it also appealed to this 2009 twee girl. And I think about also the style of somebody like Zooey Deschanel or even like a Rashida Jones. This sort of style also appealed to that. It was sort of like a counterpoint to the indie sleaze girl. Like she could in some ways be both, but to me indie sleaze was inspired by aspects of grunge, may have been a little bit more nightlife driven, whereas twee was maybe a little bit nerdier, maybe more, instead of like going to the indie shows, this girl was going going to the indie coffee niche bookstores, like things like that. Color's a little bit more subdued. Yeah, and thinking about that like Marc Jacobs style, like that definitely spoke to this kind of late 2000s twee girl as well. Another bag I also thought was worthwhile mentioning was the Hermes Gypsière. Again, another style that felt very of that period. Jean-Paul Gaultier reinterpreted the Kelly style as a modern, more casual kind of crossbody. It spoke to that kind of equestrian chic practicality, hands-free but still luxurious. Also very difficult to get in and out of. That rounded sort of flap closure with the Kelly style clasp definitely has like a totally different feel than if we think about like the Kelly or the Birkin. So another style that I have to talk about is from Fendi. So if we think about Fendi, Fendi had a real moment with the baguette, of course, created late 90s. During the Y2K era, that bag did really well. And then we saw the slouchy spy bag. But in 2009, they came out with this style, which is very different. And it's the Fendi Peekaboo. More put together, a lot more polished. As the name states, it's a peekaboo. The design plays with this idea of revealing and concealing. When the bag is closed, it does look like a traditional bag, but when the front flap is pulled down, it reveals the interior, and maybe it's a little bit more colorful, maybe it has the branding, but it gives you that sense of surprise. We see like the evolution of a brand like Fendi, and I think 2009 was, again, when we think about the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, it really reshaped how people were consuming fashion. People wanted things that would be less trend driven and something that they could probably wear for a longer time period. When we think about bags like the Fendi Peekaboo, a bag like that spoke to that. But fashion that was really extravagant felt a little bit out of step for the time. Luxury houses still had products to offer, but again, it was less about the status, and there was, I think, room for something new. Out of this sparked creativity. Out of the recession came a surge of fresh ideas from emerging designers like be it Pranza Schouler, Alexander Wang, Stella McCartney, who were no longer these kind of designers operating on the fringes. They started to step into the spotlight, and their work felt very agile and inventive and spoke to the times and connected to how a lot of young people were actually living. And a lot of the handbags of 2009 capture this transition perfectly. The school bag inspired shapes, the multifunctional designs, and a lot of the materials that would challenge old notions of luxury. And a lot of these bags symbolized a break from the glossy, logo-heavy bags of the past years and ushered in an era where a different kind of experimentation would carry more weight than like the overt status symbols that bags were. And so in hindsight, 2009 wasn't only about survival during a downturn, it was about reinvention. And the recession forced fashion to shed some of its excess, but in the process, it cleared space for a new wave of independent creativity that would define the next decade. So yes, that's my video for today. Thank you so much for joining me in another one, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!